I need to tell you about the Garcias. Not because anything happened to them. That's what I kept telling myself. Nothing happened to the Garcias. They moved. People move. That's a normal thing that normal people do in normal towns, and Braxton is a normal town. I've been saying that for 14 years. 14 years as a patrol officer, then sergeant, in a town of 6,000 people, in the eastern half of a state I'm not going to name, and I need you to understand, I'm not telling you this because I found something. I'm telling you this because I finally stopped pretending I hadn't already seen it. Every cop has a moment where the job gets quiet in a way that feels wrong. Not dangerous quiet. Not the silence before something kicks off. More like the silence of something that finished a long time ago and you just didn't notice. That's what Braxton sounds like to me now. Like it finished. Let me back up. I was born 38 miles from Braxton, in a town even smaller. I went to the academy at 22, got posted here at 23, and I have been here ever since. I know every road. I know which street lights flicker and which ones the city just never replaced. I know which dogs bark at cruisers and which ones don't. I know the family names, the feuds, the lot lines. I know where the creek floods in March and which basement windows leak when it does. I'm telling you this so you understand. I am not an outsider who stumbled into something. I am the thing I stumbled into. I have been operating inside it, wearing the uniform, carrying the authority, being the mechanism, for over a decade. The Garcias lived at 414 Beaumont, 3-bedroom ranch, chain-link fence, an above-ground pool they put up every May and took down every September. Jorge worked at the grain elevator. Maria taught second grade at Braxton Elementary. They had 2 kids, both under 10. Normal family, normal street, the kind of household you drive past on patrol and never think about because nothing is ever wrong there. That's the thing. I drove past 414 Beaumont almost every shift for 6 years. I waved at Jorge, he waved back. Sometimes Maria would be sitting on the porch with a glass of something and she'd give that little nod, that small-town acknowledgement that says, I see you, and you see me, and everything is fine. They left in November of 2019. I didn't know they'd left until January. That's 2 months. 2 months where I drove past that house, on a street I patrolled almost daily, and I did not notice that a family of 4 was gone. When I say I didn't notice, I don't mean I forgot. I mean I looked at that house and felt nothing missing. The porch light was off, the driveway was empty, the curtains were drawn, and some part of my brain, the part that's supposed to notice when things change on your beat, just smoothed it over. Like a tongue running over a gap where a tooth used to be, except the tongue tells you the tooth is still there. I only found out because I ran into Dave Kimball at the hardware store and he mentioned that Garcia's place was going on the market. I said something like, oh, are they upgrading? And Dave looked at me like I'd said something a little bit stupid and said, no, Troy, they left. Back in November, moved to her sister's place in Tucson. And I stood there in the hardware store holding a box of drywall screws and I felt this. I don't know, not alarm, more like a ripple. Like dropping a pebble into a pond that shouldn't have been there. I said, ha. That's what I said. Ha. That's what I said. Ha. Like finding out your neighbor switched cable providers. I drove past 414 Beaumont that night on patrol. House dark. Nobody home. And this time I felt it. The absence. It was loud. It was the loudest thing on the street. And I realized the only reason I was feeling it now was because Dave had told me to. If Dave hadn't said anything, how much longer would I have just not noticed? That was the first ripple. And I want to be precise about this. Nothing supernatural is happening. There are no monsters in Braxton, no secret rituals, no government program, no creature in the woods. What I'm going to describe to you is worse than all of that, because all of that would give me something to point at, something outside myself. What I found in Braxton is a pattern, and the pattern is us. Okay, let me tell you about the town. Braxton sits in a shallow valley, which means it holds heat in summer and fog in November. The main road, Route 11, runs north-south through the center, and basically everything that matters is within 4 blocks of it. You've got the courthouse, the diner, the farm and fleet, 2 churches, 1 bar, the elementary school, the post office. Standard stuff. If you've ever driven through the rural middle of any state and blinked through a town that felt like a photograph of itself, that's Braxton. Population has been between 5,000 and 7,000 for as long as anyone tracks. It doesn't grow. It doesn't collapse. The grain elevator keeps running, the school keeps graduating classes of 60 to 80 kids, and the assessed property values stay in this narrow band that never quite triggers any state-level attention. People are born here, or they come here, and then they're here. That's it. I want to describe what daily policing in Braxton looks like, because this matters. It's boring. Genuinely. I don't say that to be dismissive. I say it because the boredom is structural. A shift in Braxton is 8 hours of driving in slow loops. You check the school zone. You park near the bar between 10 and midnight on weekends. You respond to maybe 1 or 2 calls. A noise complaint, a fender bender in the Farm and Fleet lot, sometimes a domestic that usually de-escalates before you arrive. We're a department of 11 officers, including the chief. Braxton doesn't have its own detective bureau. Anything that requires investigation gets handed to the county sheriff's office. In 14 years, I have personally handled 0 homicides, 2 serious assaults, both domestic, both resolved with arrests, and maybe a dozen burglaries, mostly unlocked vehicles. This is important. Hold this in your head. Braxton is safe. It is, by every metric that law enforcement tracks, one of the safest communities in the region. Low crime, low recidivism, low domestic violence rates per capita. Our call volume is so low that state funding reviews have twice recommended reducing our department size, and both times the city council argued successfully that community presence justified the headcount. Braxton is safe. I believed that for 13 years. Here's what started to change. In early 2020, right before everything shut down, the department got a new records management system. The county had been consolidating databases, and we migrated all our old paper logs and dispatch records into this shared digital platform. It wasn't a big deal, mostly clerical. Donna, our office administrator, spent about 3 weeks scanning and entering old files. As part of the migration, I helped review about 10 years of call logs to make sure the data transferred cleanly. And when I say helped, I mean Donna did 90% of the work, and I sat there with a binder of old dispatch slips checking them against what showed up on screen. This is how I met the pattern. It didn't jump out. It seeped. Because I wasn't looking for anything. I was doing tedious data entry. My brain was in that half-focused state where you notice things sideways. And what I noticed, very slowly, over the course of about a week of this work, was a rhythm. Braxton's call logs had a rhythm. Let me explain what I mean. In any town, calls come in clusters. Friday and Saturday nights are busier. Holidays spike. Summer is louder than winter. That's normal. What I was seeing in Braxton's logs was something else, a regularity that was too clean. Every year, in a rough band between October and December, there was a cluster of calls related to the same category, welfare checks. Specifically, welfare checks requested by neighbors on households that, according to the resolution notes, turned out to be fine, no contact necessary, resident confirmed present, all clear. Individually, these were nothing. A neighbor hadn't seen Mrs. So-and-so in a few days, so they called. We sent a car. She was home. Case closed. But the volume was wrong. In a town of 6,000, we were averaging 11 to 15 of these calls every fall, and almost none at other times of year. The national average for welfare check calls in a community this size is maybe 4 to 6 per year, spread relatively evenly. Braxton was tripling that number and compressing it into a 3-month window. I mentioned it to Donna. She looked at the numbers, shrugged, and said it was probably because people noticed absence more when the weather changed. When it gets cold, you pay attention to whether your neighbor's lights are on. Made sense. I accepted that. But I kept the binder. I didn't take it home or anything dramatic. I just didn't put it back in the storage closet. It sat on the corner of my desk in the squad room, and every couple of weeks I'd flip through it while eating lunch. Not investigating, just reading, like a crossword I hadn't finished. And I started noticing the names, not the callers, the subjects, the people the welfare checks were about. In 2016, there were 14 welfare checks between October and December. 6 of those subjects, the people being checked on, were not in the Braxton directory by the following spring. They had moved. In 2017, there were 12 welfare checks in that window. 5 of those subjects were gone by April. In 2018, 11 checks, 4 subjects gone. In 2019, 13 checks, 7 subjects gone. The Garcias were one of the 7. Now, people move. I need to keep saying this because the pattern is the kind of thing that collapses under any single point of scrutiny. Each individual case is nothing. Jorge and Maria moved to Tucson. The Wellmans retired to Florida. Dale Hutchins got a job in Omaha. Ask anyone in town, and they'll give you a perfectly reasonable story for each departure. I'm sure the stories are even true. But the correlation held. year after year. The people Braxton noticed were missing, even briefly, even incorrectly, were disproportionately the people who left. As if noticing was the first step of something. I need to stop here and tell you what I did not do. I did not investigate. I did not bring this to Chief Parish. I did not request case files from the county. I did not contact any of the people who'd moved to ask why they left. I did not do any of the things that a competent officer, noticing a statistical anomaly on his own beat, should have done. What I did was close the binder, put it in my desk drawer, and go back on patrol. And the reason I did that, the honest reason, not the excuse I built later, is that I recognized something in the pattern that I didn't want to look at directly. Some of those welfare check calls were mine. Not all of them, not even most. But I had personally responded to welfare checks during that October-December window at least twice a year, every year for a decade. I had driven to those houses, I had knocked on those doors, I had marked them all clear and moved on. And some of those people were gone, within months. I want to be very careful here. I am not saying I caused anyone to leave. I'm not saying knocking on a door at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday in November made anyone move to Tucson. What I'm saying is that I was part of the rhythm that shouldn't have existed. And if I pulled on that thread, I might find my own hands at the other end. So I didn't pull. That was 2020. The pandemic hit. And Braxton went quiet in a new way. A way that made sense, and I let the rhythm recede into background noise. For almost a year I didn't think about it. Then the Okafor family came to town. Emeka and Ngozi Okafor bought the old Prentice house on Sycamore in May 2021. He was the civil engineer consulting remotely. She was finishing a degree online. They had a son, Tobias, who was about to start 3rd grade. They were the first black family in Braxton in at least 4 years. That fact is relevant, and I'll tell you why in a moment. I met them the way I meet most new residents, on patrol. I saw the moving truck, pulled over, introduced myself, gave the standard welcome speech. Emeka was friendly, cautiously friendly. The way someone is when a police officer shows up unannounced while they're carrying furniture. I told him if he needed anything, the department was a phone call away. He said thanks. I left. Over the next few months I saw them around. Tobias at the elementary school, a nosy at the grocery store, Emeka mowing the lawn on Saturdays. Normal integration into a small town. And then October came. I was on shift when the first call came in, October 14th. A welfare check request for a 1318 Eddie, Sycamore, the Okafor house. The caller was a neighbor, Mrs. Pruitt, 3 doors down. She said she hadn't seen Mrs. Okafor in a few days and was just checking. I took the call, drove over. Gobrazar answered the door with Tobias on her hip and a spatula in her hand. She was fine. She'd been home all week. I apologized for the bother, went back to my car, and marked it all clear. 2 weeks later, another call. Different neighbor. Same concern. Hadn't seen the Okafors around. Again, they were home. Again, all clear. November 3rd, 3rd call. This time about Emeka, specifically. A co-worker at the grain elevator. Emeka didn't work there, so I'm not even sure what the connection was. Said he seemed withdrawn and wanted someone to check in. I sat in my cruiser after that 3rd call and I felt the binder in my desk drawer like a physical weight. 3 welfare checks on the same family in 3 weeks. The Okafors had been in Braxton for 5 months. They were fine. They were present. Their lights were on. Their car was in the driveway. Their kid was in school. And the town was checking on them. I want to describe something that doesn't have a good name. In policing, we have phrases for most things. Probable cause, reasonable suspicion, exigent circumstances. These are categories that let you act. But there's no phrase for the thing I was feeling, which was, a system operating correctly is producing a result that might be wrong, and I can't locate the error because each individual component is fine. Mrs. Pruitt calling about her neighbor? Fine. A concerned coworker? Fine. People checking on people? That's community. That's what safe towns do. That's what Braxton's entire identity is built on. People looking out for each other. But 3 calls in 3 weeks on a family that was home the entire time? I went to the diner after shift. I go there most nights. It's the kind of place where the waitress knows you order and half the stools are occupied by people you went to high school with. I sat at the counter and I asked Carol, the evening waitress, if she knew the Okafors. She said, "Oh, sure, nice family, keep to themselves a bit." I asked what she meant by that. She said, they don't come to the pancake breakfast, don't really show up at the football games, not unfriendly or anything, just Haven't plugged in yet. And then she said something that landed different. She said, I hope they settle in. It'd be a shame if they didn't feel welcome. She said it warmly. Genuinely. Carol is not a malicious person. She has never, in any interaction I've witnessed, been cruel to anyone. She said it the way you say. I hope the weather holds, or I hope your mom's feeling better. But I heard it the way you hear a sentence after you've read the binder. I hope they settle in. As in, settling in is something that's being observed. As in, there is a timeline. As in, a determination will be made. I'm reading too much into it. I know that. That's what I told myself then. And it's probably what you're thinking now. A waitress said a nice thing about a family, and I turned it into a threat because I'd been staring at 10 years of welfare check data and pattern matching where there was no pattern, except there was a pattern. The numbers were right there. Let me tell you about the Hendersons. Jim and Patty Henderson moved to Braxton in 2015 from outside Chicago. Jim was retired. Patty was a quilter who sold online. They bought a fixer-upper on Cedar Lane and spent their first summer renovating. Nice people. A little louder than Braxton average. Jim had a big laugh. Patty played music in the garage while she worked. Not obnoxious, just present. You could hear the Hendersons living their life, which in a town this quiet is a form of visibility. October 2015, 2 welfare checks, both filed by neighbors, both marked all clear. November 2015, 1 more welfare check, all clear. November 2015, 1 more welfare check. The Hendersons left in February 2016, moved back to Illinois. I ran into Jim Henderson's name again while I was going through the call logs. 3 months before they left, 3 separate neighbors had called to check on them. 3 neighbors who, when I thought about it, hadn't been particularly close to the Hendersons. Hadn't been to their house for dinner, hadn't borrowed tools from their garage, just noticed them, the way a body notices a splinter. And I'm going to say this clearly because it matters. The Hendersons are white. Patty Henderson is from Schaumburg. Jim Henderson worked for Caterpillar for 30 years. This is not a story about one kind of person being driven out. This is about something else, something less visible, and I don't have the vocabulary for it yet. The Hendersons left because, well, here's what Patty told Linda at the post office. They missed their grandkids. That's a reason. That's a real reason. I don't dispute it. But 3 welfare checks in 3 months on a couple who was home the entire time, from neighbors who barely knew them, the town was doing something. Not deliberately, not with coordination, not through meetings or whisper campaigns or any mechanism I could identify. There was no conspiracy. That would have been easier. What was happening, what I think was happening, is that Braxton had a kind of collective attention, a distributed awareness, and when that awareness focused on a household, it started generating contact, check-ins, waves, knocks on doors, little questions at the post office. Are you doing okay? Haven't seen you around. Just wanted to make sure. And every single one of those contacts was kind. That's the part that makes this so difficult to talk about. Nobody was threatening anyone. Nobody was leaving notes or making anonymous calls. Well, the calls were to us, the police, asking us to check on people, which is a civic act, a good neighbor act. The kind of thing that Braxton is proud of and that I, personally, have praised in community meetings. But the cumulative effect of being checked on, of being noticed, monitored, confirmed, was that the people at the center of that attention started to leave. Not immediately, not in fear. They left the way the Garcias left, quietly. For reasonable reasons, to be closer to family, for a new job, because the winters were hard, because they just decided it was time. Every reason was real. No single departure was suspicious, but the batting average was unnatural. I need to tell you about something I did in 2022 that I'm not proud of. By this point, I'd been quietly tracking the welfare check pattern for about 2 years. I hadn't told anyone. I had a spreadsheet on my personal laptop, nothing from official files, just names and dates I'd memorized. And I was checking it against the town directory every spring. The correlation held. Every single fall, a cluster of welfare checks. Every following spring, a subset of those subjects were gone, and I decided to test something. It was September, October hadn't started yet, the welfare check calls hadn't started coming in, and I thought, what if I'm wrong? What if this is just seasonal noise and I've built a conspiracy out of spreadsheet artifacts? There's one way to check. If the pattern is real, I should be able to predict who gets checked on before any calls come in. So I made a list. I drove my regular patrol routes and I paid attention, not to crime, not to safety, but to that other thing. That sideways feeling, the thing I'd trained myself to ignore for 13 years. I asked myself, who in Braxton feels slightly wrong? Not wrong like danger, wrong like texture. Like a fabric with one thread that's a slightly different weight. You can't see it, but you can feel it when you run your hand across. I came up with 4 households. I'm not going to give you the details of how I identified them, because the method was, I need to be honest, the method was nothing. I just drove around and felt something. That's not police work. That's not even intuition, which is a word cops use to make guessing sound professional. It was a kind of attention. The same attention the town was using. I was doing the thing I was trying to investigate. I wrote down 4 addresses. I sealed them in an envelope. I put the envelope in my glove compartment. I dated it September 22, 2022. October came. By December, 3 of my 4 households had been the subject of welfare check calls. I sat in my cruiser on Christmas Eve and I opened that envelope, and I looked at the addresses and I felt something I don't think I felt before or since. It wasn't fear. It wasn't satisfaction at being right. It was more like vertigo. Like looking down and realizing you're standing on glass and below the glass is nothing, and you've been standing there your whole life. I was right. The pattern was real, and I had demonstrated to myself that I could operate it. I could feel what the town felt. I could identify the targets before the process began. I wasn't observing the pattern, I was part of its sensing apparatus. I need to talk about how Braxton sees itself, because this is load-bearing for everything that comes next. There's a sign on Route 11 as you come into town. It says, "Welcome me to Braxton. We're Nabzor's family." It's been there since before I was posted. The paint gets refreshed every few years by volunteers. Underneath it, in smaller text, it lists Braxton's awards, Safest Community in the Region 2008, 2011, 2016. Community Spirit Award from the State Chamber of Commerce 2014. These are real awards. Braxton earned them. The metrics are legitimate. Low crime, high civic engagement, strong volunteerism, well-maintained public spaces. When the state sends evaluators, they find a town that functions. People vote, attend school board meetings, show up to the annual 4th of July parade, donate to the fire department's boot drive, organize meal trains when someone has surgery. This is real. I've lived inside it for 14 years. I have benefited from it. When my mother was dying and I was driving back and forth to her hospice 60 miles away, people left food on my porch. Not one person. Multiple people. On multiple days, without being asked. That's Braxton. That's the town I swore to protect. And that same town, with that same warmth, that same attentiveness, that same instinct to look after each other, was producing a mechanism that moved people out. The thing I need you to understand, and the thing that took me the longest to accept, is that there's no version of Braxton where the good parts exist without the bad part. The care and the culling come from the same organ. The neighbors who left food on my porch and the neighbors who called in welfare checks on the Garcias were, in several cases, the same people. I don't know what to do with that. Let me get back to the Okafors. By January 2022, they'd been in Braxton for about 8 months, and they'd accumulated 5 welfare check calls. 5. That was already above the per-household average I'd seen in the data. Most families that the pattern touched got 2 or 3 before they left. 5 meant something. It meant the town was paying sustained attention. I decided, and I want to emphasize that this was a personal decision, not a professional one, to check in on the Okafors myself. Not as a welfare check. As a visit. I went on a Saturday, out of uniform, in my own truck. I brought a 6-pack, because that's what you bring. A Mecha answered the door. He was guarded. Not hostile. But there was a set to his shoulders that I recognized, because I'd seen it in people who've been contacted by law enforcement one too many times. That careful posture that says, I will be polite and I will not give you a reason. I said I was off duty, just stopping by, brought some beer. He let me in. Gozy was in the kitchen. Tobias was on the living room floor with Legos. Normal house. Normal family. Photographs on the wall. Their wedding, Tobias as a baby, a group shot that looked like extended family, a crucifix over the hallway, shoes by the door. We sat at the kitchen table and drank beer and talked about nothing for about 20 minutes. The weather, the school, whether the grain elevator was going to get the new silo it had been talking about. Normal, small-town conversation. Then Emeka said something I want to transcribe as exactly as I can remember. He said, "Troy, can I ask you something?" And I'd like an honest answer. I said, "Sure." He said, "Are we in some kind of trouble?" I said no. Why would he think that? He said, because everyone in this town is watching us. He didn't say it with anger, he said it with exhaustion. The kind of tired that comes from being vigilant for months without knowing what you're vigilant against. He said the neighbors waved at them every single time they left the house. Every time. That people he'd never met would stop him at the grocery store and ask how they were settling in. That Tobias's teacher had called 3 times in one semester to check in. Not about behavior problems, not about grades, just to see how things were going. That their mailman had started leaving little notes in their box, just friendly ones, just welcome to the neighborhood kind of things, but in November. They'd been there since May. Why was the mailman welcoming them in November? He said, I grew up in Houston. I know what it looks like when a town doesn't want you. This isn't that. This is the opposite. Everyone is very, very nice. And they won't stop. Nosy from the kitchen said, it feels like being held. And then she corrected herself. She said, it feels like being held in place while someone decides something. I sat there with my beer going warm in my hand, and I didn't say anything for a long time, because she was right. That's exactly what it was, and I was part of it. I had taken welfare check calls on this house. I had driven past it on patrol and felt something, that sideways wrongness, and I had never once considered that the wrongness wasn't coming from the Okafors. It was coming from me. From my attention, from the attention of every person in Braxton who looked at this family and felt that little texture difference and responded with care. Aggressive, focused, smothering care. I told him, Mecca, that I'd noticed some things about the town that I couldn't fully explain yet. I told him I didn't think they were in danger. I told him, and this is where I failed, this is the part I can't undo. I told him that Braxton was just a close-knit community, and it took people a while to stop being the new folks. I lied to him. I lied because the truth. Your town is assessing you, and I don't know what the assessment criteria are or what happens if you fail, would have sounded insane. And because saying it out loud would have meant acknowledging my role in the process. I left. I drove home. I sat in my kitchen and I looked at my spreadsheet and I added the Okafor household to my tracking list, and I felt the specific kind of self-loathing that comes from doing something you know is wrong while telling yourself it's the best available option. I was tracking them now, just like the town was. Spring 2022. The Okafors were still in Braxton. The welfare check calls had stopped. They always stopped in spring, and the town seemed to have relaxed its attention. Tobias was finishing 3rd grade. Noshi had started coming to the Saturday farmers market, selling plantain chips that were honestly excellent, and Mecca had joined the volunteer fire department. They were integrating, plugging in, doing the things that Braxton seemed to want people to do. And I thought maybe it works both ways. Maybe the pattern isn't a culling mechanism. Maybe it's more like an immune response. And if the body recognizes you as self instead of other, the response stops. The Okafors were being incorporated, and the attention would subside, and everything would be fine. I wanted that to be true so badly. That summer was quiet. I did my patrols. I went to the 4th of July parade. I ate at the diner. I was Braxton, and Braxton was me, and the binder stayed in my desk drawer. Then October came again. The first welfare check call on the Okafors came in on October 8th. I wasn't on shift. Danny Rivera took it. All clear. The second came on October 19th. I was on shift. I drove to 1118 Sycamore, and I sat in the driveway for a full minute before I got out of the car, because I didn't want to knock on that door. I didn't want to be the hand of the thing I'd been watching. Nukosi answered. She looked at me and I could see it. The recognition. Not of me as Troy, the off-duty neighbor who brought beer. Of me as the uniform. The mechanism. The check. She said, "We're fine, officer. Officer. Not Troy. I had been reclassified." I said, "I know. I'm sorry." She started to close the door and then stopped. She said, "Troy, how many times is this going to happen?" I said, I didn't know. She said, "What do we have to do?" I didn't have an answer. I got back in my cruiser and I sat there and I ran the numbers in my head. The Okafors had now accumulated 7 welfare checks across 2 autumn cycles. No family in my data had hit 7 and stayed. The maximum I tracked was 6, the Wellmans, in 2017, and they'd been gone by March. I need to tell you what I did next because it's the crux of this whole thing and it's the part I'm least equipped to explain. I decided to interfere. Not through official channels. Not by filing a report or talking to the chief or doing anything that a sergeant with concerns about a pattern in his jurisdiction should do. I interfered personally, quietly, In a way that I can only describe as trying to game a system I couldn't prove existed, I started visiting the Okafors regularly, off-duty, in my own clothes, in my own truck. I'd come by on weekends, bring something, a pie from the diner, a toy for Tobias, whatever. I made it social, neighborly. I sat on their porch and I talked to Emeka about engineering, and I helped Nosy stake tomato plants, and I let Tobias show me his Lego sets, and I was, by every external measure, being a good neighbor. But what I was actually doing, what I was trying to do, was insert myself into the equation. I thought that if the town's attention was the problem, maybe I could redirect it. If I was visibly connected to the Okafors, maybe the pattern would incorporate that data. Troy likes them, Troy is with them, they're part of Troy's network, and Troy is part of Braxton, so the Okafors are part of Braxton. I was trying to teach the town to recognize them as self. I understand how that sounds. I understand that I'm describing a small-town police sergeant trying to manipulate a sociological phenomenon he can't prove exists through strategic friendship. I understand that every part of this sounds like paranoia or narcissism or both, but the calls stopped. November 2022, no welfare checks on the Okafors. First time in 2 years. December, nothing. January 2023, nothing. I started to breathe. Whatever the pattern was, whatever distributed attention mechanism Braxton was operating, my presence in the Okafor's social web had disrupted it. They were being reclassified, incorporated. The immune response was standing down. Except, I need to tell you about the Chens. David and Lily Chen moved to Braxton in August 2022. He was a pharmacist. The town had been trying to fill that position for 2 years. She was a photographer. No kids. They rented the apartment above the old hardware store on Route 11. I did the same welcome stop, shook hands, said if you need anything. David was earnest and eager in a way that made me like him immediately. Lily was quieter, watchful. They'd moved from Portland. They wanted space, they said, a slower pace. The things people always say when they come to towns like Braxton. October 2022, the same October where the Okafor calls stopped. The first welfare check call came in on the Chens, then the second. Then in November, a third. I pulled the call records. The callers were different neighbors, different names, but the language was identical to every other welfare check request in my binder. Haven't seen them in a few days. Just wanted to make sure they're okay. I'm sure it's nothing. The Chen household had become the focus. And here's where I have to say the thing I've been circling. I had spent months pouring my attention into the Okafors, building social connections, inserting myself into their network. And during that exact period, my attention had been withdrawn from every other part of my beat. I wasn't driving past the Chen's apartment with the same frequency. I wasn't noticing them. I wasn't registering their presence in the way that apparently was necessary for the town to leave them alone. Had I moved the target? Had my intervention, my strategic friendship, my well-intentioned manipulation, simply redirected the town's attention from one household to another? I sat with that for a long time. Weeks. I didn't sleep well. I started making mistakes on shift. Minor things, paperwork errors, missing a call by a few minutes. Chief Parrish asked if I was doing okay, and I said yes because what was I going to tell him? I think I accidentally aimed the town at someone. The Chens left in March 2023. David transferred to a pharmacy in Bend, Oregon. Lily posted on Facebook about how excited they were for the next chapter. Perfectly normal. Perfectly voluntary. 5 welfare checks over 6 months, and then gone. I had not saved the Okafors. I had sacrificed the Chens. No, that's too dramatic. That implies I had power I didn't have. The Chens made their own choice. They left for their own reasons. I didn't make them leave. The town didn't make them leave. Nobody held a gun. Nobody wrote a threatening letter. Nobody did anything other than be attentive and caring and present in a way that, accumulated and sustained, becomes indistinguishable from pressure. This is the thing I can't get anyone to understand because there is nothing to point at. If I went to the chief and said, "Chief, I believe our town has an involuntary sociological mechanism that identifies residents who don't fully integrate and subjects them to escalating benevolent attention until they self-select out of the community," what would he do? What policy addresses that? What law has been broken? Caring about your neighbors isn't a crime. Calling for a welfare check isn't harassment. Waving at someone isn't intimidation. Leaving a welcome note in a mailbox in November isn't threatening. But doing all of those things in concert without coordination as an emergent property of a community that is very, very good at watching, that's something. I just don't know what to call it. Let me tell you about the conversation that broke me. It was April 2023. I was at the diner after shift, like always. Carol brought my coffee, like always. And I asked her, casually, the way you ask about weather, if she remembered the Chens. She said, "Oh, the pharmacist. Sure. Shame they didn't stick around." I asked if she knew why they left. She said, "I don't think they ever felt at home here, honestly. Some people don't. It's sad, but it happens." And I said, and this is the first time I'd said anything like this to anyone. I said, "Carol, do you think we make it hard for some people to feel at home?" She looked at me. Not offended. Not defensive. Thoughtful. The way she looks when you ask her whether the pie is fresh or from yesterday, like she's genuinely considering the question. And she said, "I think Braxton takes care of its own." And I think some people just aren't Braxton people. There's nothing wrong with that. It's nobody's fault. She said it with complete sincerity, zero malice, and I realized she was telling the truth as she understood it. Carol was not a conspirator. She was not conscious of the mechanism. She was the mechanism. The same way I was the mechanism. The same way every person who'd ever called in a welfare check or asked, "How are you settling in?" was the mechanism. We were all doing it. None of us were deciding to do it. It was like watching a flock of birds turn in the sky. No single bird decides. The turn happens. The flock moves. And any bird that doesn't turn gets left behind. I want to talk about who leaves. I've been careful not to make this about one thing, because it isn't about one thing. The Hendersons were white retirees from Illinois. The Garcias were a Latino family from Tucson. The Chens were Asian American from Portland. The Okafors were Nigerian American from Houston. The Wellmans were a white couple from Vermont. It's not race. It's not class. It's not religion or politics or education. The closest I can get, and I thought about this for years, is that the people who trigger the pattern are the ones who exist at a slightly different frequency. I don't mean that metaphysically. I mean that the rhythm of their lives, when they turn their lights on, how they use their front porch, whether they walk to the mailbox or drive, how they greet people at the store, some aggregate of 1,000 tiny behavioral signals, doesn't quite match the town's rhythm. And Braxton can hear the dissonance, not with ears, not consciously, but collectively, in the way a hive knows when a bee isn't from this hive. The town can feel when someone isn't oscillating at the right frequency. And it responds, not with aggression, never with aggression, with attention, with care, with checking in, with that focused, warm, suffocating concern that says, "We see you, we see you, we see you," until the person at the center of that gaze either changes their frequency or leaves. Most of them leave. I think some of them change. I think I changed 14 years ago. This is the part I've been avoiding. I moved to Braxton at 23. I was from a town 38 miles away, but that's not Braxton. That's somewhere else. And I remember, this is dim now, faded the way old memories fade. I remember my first October here. I remember feeling watched. I remember thinking the town was unusually friendly. I remember a neighbor calling the department to check on me, the new officer, because she hadn't seen my car in the driveway for a few days. I was on shift. I was at work. My car was in the department lot. She called anyway. And I remember, this is the part that feels like touching a live wire, I remember considering leaving. In my first year, I remember calling my mom and saying I wasn't sure Braxton was the right fit. I remember that feeling of being held in place while someone decided something. I didn't leave. I stayed. And at some point, I cannot tell you when, I have tried to pinpoint it, and at some point, I stopped feeling the attention. I stopped noticing the noticing. The frequency of my life synced with the frequency of Braxton, and I became part of the town, and the town became part of me, and I have been a fully functional component of this system for over a decade. I am not the detective in this story. I am the antibody that almost became the virus. I didn't figure this out because I'm observant. I figured it out because I spent 3 weeks looking at old paperwork, and the data was too clean to ignore. If Donna had done the migration herself, if I'd called in sick that week, I'd still be driving my patrols, waving at families that the town would eventually process out, feeling nothing but the satisfied boredom of a safe community. The Okafors are still in Braxton. It's been a few years now. Tobias is in middle school. Emeka made lieutenant on the volunteer fire department. Nochie's plantain chips are a fixture at the farmer's market. They're integrated. They're Braxton. And I watch them sometimes, on patrol from a distance, and I wonder, did they change? Did their frequency shift? Or did my interference actually work, and the town incorporated them because I vouched for them? And if it's the second one, if my attention, my connection, my endorsement is what saved them, then what am I? What's the word for a person who can grant or withhold belonging based on their own social investment? What's the difference between that and the thing I was afraid of? I'll tell you the answer. There's no difference. I became the mechanism I was trying to expose. The only thing that changed is that now I choose who it targets. I need to tell you about last October. A new family moved to town in September. I'm not going to give you their name. I'm not going to tell you what street they're on. I'm going to tell you what happened when the first welfare check call came in. I was on shift. I took the call. I drove to the house. I knocked on the door. A woman answered. She was fine. Her kids were fine. Her husband was at work. Everything was fine. And as I walked back to my cruiser, I felt it. That sideways thing. That texture difference. The faint wrongness. That isn't wrongness at all. It's just newness. It's just difference. It's just a family that hasn't learned the rhythm yet. I felt the town feeling it, and I felt myself feeling it, and I could not tell where the town ended. And I began. I sat in the cruiser and I had a choice. I could do what I did for the Okafors. Start visiting. Build the connection. Vouch. Insert myself into the social web and teach the town to accept them. Or I could do nothing. Drive away. Let the pattern run. See what happened. I want to tell you that I made the right choice. I want to tell you that I went back and knocked on the door and said, "Hey, I'm Troy. Let me bring you a pie. Let me help you settle in. Let me protect you from the thing that I am." But here's what actually went through my mind as I sat in that cruiser. I thought, I'm tired. I thought, I can't do this for every family. I thought, the Okafors took 8 months of sustained personal effort, and even then I might have just pushed the target to the Chens. And I thought, maybe they'll be fine. Maybe they'll find their frequency. Most people do, eventually. The ones who don't, they leave. They go somewhere else. They find a town that fits. That's not the worst thing. I was thinking like Braxton. I drove away. That family is still here. It's spring now. They made it through the October-December window. I checked 4 welfare check calls. They're still here. Maybe they changed. Maybe they were going to be fine regardless. Maybe the pattern isn't as powerful as I think it is, and I've built a narrative out of statistical noise and guilty conscience. But there's another family now, moved in about 2 months ago, and I can already feel it. That little vibration. That collective attention beginning to orient. I could help. I could intervene. I could also go to the diner and order my coffee and talk to Carol about the weather, and let Braxton be Braxton. You want to know the scariest thing about this? It's not the pattern. It's not the welfare checks. It's not the thought that a town can organically, unconsciously develop a sorting mechanism that preserves its own character by gently pressuring non-conforming elements to self-select out. The scariest thing is that every town does this. Every community, every workplace, every church, every school, every neighborhood, every friend group, they all have a frequency. They all have a mechanism for identifying who fits and who doesn't. They all apply pressure, gently, warmly, through inclusion and attention and care, until the ones who don't fit either change or leave. Braxton is just small enough that one person can see it. Your town does it too. You just don't have the binder. I turned in my resignation 3 weeks ago. Chief Parrish asked why. I told him I was burned out. He said he understood. He said Braxton would miss me. He said, "You're a Braxton person, Troy. You always have been." I hope you're not going far. I'm not going far. I'm moving 38 miles east, back to where I was born. I'm going home, or to the place I came from anyway. I don't know if it's home. I don't know if anywhere is, now. The department will hire a replacement, someone new. Someone who'll drive the routes and take the calls and wave at the families and sit at the diner counter and slowly, over months and years, sync their frequency to the town's frequency until they can't feel the hum anymore. And next October, the calls will start. I took the binder with me. It's in a box in my truck with the rest of my things. I don't know what to do with it. It's not evidence of a crime. It's evidence of a community. The same community that fed me when my mother was dying. The same community that taught me how to belong. Emeka called me last week. He'd heard I was leaving. He said he was sorry to see me go. He said the town wouldn't be the same. I almost told him everything. About the binder. The pattern, the calls, the way I'd spent 8 months engineering his family's survival in a system I couldn't name. I almost told him that the reason his family is still in Braxton is because I made a choice, and the reason the Chens are gone is because I made a different one, and the reason I'm leaving is because I can't keep making those choices for people. But I didn't tell him, because he's happy. His kid is in school, and his wife sells plantain chips on Saturdays, and he fights fires with guys who clap him on the back and call him brother. He belongs now. And the cost of him belonging is a pharmacist in Bend, Oregon, who thinks he just didn't like small-town life. I keep the spreadsheet. I keep the binder. I will keep checking the Braxton directory every spring from 38 miles away, in a town that probably has its own frequency, its own pattern, its own way of holding people in place while it decides what they are. I'm not warning you. There's nothing to warn you about. Your neighbors are kind. Your community cares. The people around you are paying attention. That's all this is. That's all it's ever been.